And the next thing I know, he starts stabbing me. When he stabbed me, those times he punctured my lung. So now I can hear the gurgling of my lung. And that was pretty scary. That was way scary. And I tried to get away from him.
I got the heart of a champion.
This is the story of Christy Martin, and it's such a compelling story that it was turned into an award-winning Netflix documentary. A story that includes possibly the greatest female boxer of all time, as well as the greatest boxing promoter of all time, Don King, and it's such an inspirational sports story. But later, it turns into a pretty grimy true crime story, and just recently it was made into a movie. This is Christy Martin.
Pounds even. With only one loss in the last 10 years, her record stands at 38 wins, 2 losses, and 2 draws, with 30 wins coming by way of knockout. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the top women's pound-for-pound boxers, known as the coal miner's daughter, introducing Christy Martin.
Christy would become a real trailblazer of women's boxing, and perhaps the greatest of all time. But funny enough, it all started because one of her friends dared her to enter a local tough man competition. And there, without any experience, she knocked out the competition. And from that point forward, she was hooked. Back in those days, women's boxing, it really wasn't much of a thing. There was no money in it, and it was kind of just like a novelty. But Christy, without any experience, she just kept knocking people out and winning fights. But she really wanted to take it to the next level and do it for a living. So she needed a real trainer because Christy, she didn't really have any technical ability, and she didn't know anything about boxing, despite knocking out competition. So she needed a trainer. And that's where Jim Martin came in. Christy was a walk-in at a local boxing gym that Jim Martin trained at. But Jim, he really didn't want anything to do with Christy. He didn't want anything to do with female boxing at all. And he secretly hoped that one of his male boxing students would knock Christy out and send her packing so she would never come back, and he could just avoid this embarrassing situation completely. But that actually didn't happen. And eventually Jim noticed that Christy is a beast, and she's green, she doesn't know anything, but she has incredible potential. And Jim Martin, as a trainer, he was super ambitious, so he latched on to Christy and he thought, this is it. This is my fighter. With Jim's help, she won fight after fight after fight, and she wasn't just winning fights. She was straight up knocking girls out. But there really wasn't any money in women's boxing, so they weren't making much of any money. But Christy, she was so good that eventually she caught the attention of the greatest boxing promoter of all time, Don King. Now, if you don't know Don King by his hair, then you don't know Don King. And he promoted only the highest level talent. And he developed some of the greatest boxers of all time, at least from a promotional standpoint. Boxers like Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, George Foreman, and so on. So when he signed Christy, it was a really big deal. And from the moment that she signed that contract, that's when she started making some serious money and getting some fights with some real talented girls. So her career started just to take off from there. So there's this guy, and his name's Mike Tyson, and he's an incredible boxer. So when Don King floated the idea of putting Christy Martin on his undercard, he was like, psh, women's boxing? No way. But when he saw some tape of Christy Martin fighting, her dog mentality, and she was just, knocking people out just like Tyson, he was like, yes, he was gung-ho. And that's when Christy got on the undercard of Mike Tyson's pay-per-view. And she fought an incredibly brutal female boxing match. It was possibly the greatest female boxing match that I've ever seen, and that I can even think of. And she won the fight. And over 80 million people saw that boxing match. And that was one of the pinnacle moments that took female boxing to, from a novelty act to being taken serious. And that really launched her career. Somewhere in the heat of the moment, through all the incredible excitement of this massive win, Christy, she kissed Jim. She kissed her trainer. And eventually they went to Kmart, got a couple of rings, and they got married. And Christy would go on this huge run of talk show after talk show after talk show, from Jay Leno to David Letterman, the whole bit. And she even got on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That was a first for female boxers. So Don King, the incredible promoter that he is, he marketed Christy as a package deal with Jim, the female boxing prodigy that's married to her trainer. It was a great promotion. And because of the package deal, Jim Martin got kind of famous too. And, that may have gotten to his head. The public loved Christy. Not only was she a female boxer that was incredibly talented, but she was knocking people out. And on top of that, she was a shit talker. She was a promoter's wet dream because she would talk so much trash to her opponent that the public loved it, and she would really put people in seats. She could really sell some tickets. But here's where the story gets a little bit complicated. Christy was a coal miner's daughter, and she grew up in a teeny tiny town in West Virginia. And Christy, growing up, she was a tomboy. She played baseball, but on a boys' team, and a catcher no less. She played basketball, and she was All-State twice. So when her and Jim got married, Jim was 25 years older than her. So their relationship was complicated. But here's the twist. Christy was gay. And Jim knew she was gay, at least in her past. And he was incredibly jealous about the whole situation. He was very controlling. But Don King, the great promoter, he promoted them as a package deal, a couple. And they were winning fights and making a lot of money. So they really had to keep up with this appearance. He had to keep up with this charade. In the award-winning Netflix documentary titled A Deal with the Devil, this is what they're talking about. Jim Martin and Christy Martin being married, even though Christy was gay. And they had to keep up these appearances to continue boxing and making all this money that, they weren't making money before. So they had to keep this up. And Jim Martin laid it out clear. Christy was the meal ticket for Jim. And, he probably wouldn't have done anything if he didn't have Christy, even though he did make her. But he laid it out clear for 20 years. If you ever leave me, I will kill you. This is Layla Ali. She's the daughter of boxing great Muhammad Ali. And this is Christy's next opponent. But she's 25 pounds heavier than Christy. Way taller. In a completely different weight class. I don't even know why they put this fight on, but it was a spectacle, is probably the answer, right? And it was highly, highly promoted. Christy was completely outmatched. And in the fight, she suffered a concussion very early in round 1. And she actually ended up losing the fight. It was her first big loss on a super big scale. So when she went back in the locker room, Jim was not even there to comfort her. He just wasn't even around. After this huge loss, everything started to fall apart. She started losing more fights than she won. And Christy was suffering. She was suffering because she had to hide the fact that she was gay. And Jim was in the background threatening her that he'll kill her if she leaves, and he will expose the fact that she's gay if she ever leaves. Back in those days, being gay was not something you openly talked about. So Jim was literally blackmailing, and she thought she was going to, ruin her career if this came out. So it was a big deal, and she was suffering. And that's when things started to just spiral out of control, because they started doing some pretty hard drugs, particularly cocaine. It started off with just Saturday and Sunday, just the weekends, and then Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And eventually they were doing it 6 to 7 nights a week. Christy was still boxing, so she was training, and then she would do cocaine. She would box, and then she would do a line. She would box, and then she would do a line. So, as you can imagine, things were just spiraling out of control. And in the midst of all this, it gets even weirder, because Jim was videotaping everything that she did at home. He was literally videotaping her and collecting evidence, so to speak, because he was blackmailing her. If she leaves him, he's got real evidence now. He's videotaping everything while they're doing drugs. So this is a pretty dire situation at this point. Christy describes Jim as a puppet master. He would make her do really crazy and weird stuff in order for her to get the coke, because Jim controlled the cocaine. And Christy had to do whatever he said to get that. And she was an addict, so she was willing to do that. And he took some pretty crazy pictures that he made her, do. You can go look that up a lot. I'm not really going to talk about that. It's pretty weird. All in the midst of this, Christy was still boxing. She still loved boxing, but she kind of outgrew Jim. After a couple of years, Jim taught her everything that he knew. And she wanted to get a different trainer, someone that could take her to the next level, because some of the other pros, they had higher level trainers. But Jim was not willing to accept this, so he said absolutely no freaking way. And Christy was disgruntled about that situation. She also wanted to get a divorce because she didn't love Jim. She was gay. She wanted to be with women. So she even went as far as to write up a contract with Jim that she would do such and such, and then they could get a divorce. But upon presenting this to Jim, he punched her in the face and, kind of messed her up. And the situation just got worse and worse and worse. And Jim wanted to teach her a lesson. So one day when they were sparring in the gym, Jim set her up and knocked her out. They were sparring and Jim knocked out his wife. This was just a controlled way to abuse Christy. And she thought she was an incredible boxer, but up against, a much larger man, she didn't stand much of a chance. But one day, by chance, when Christy got online, she got on Facebook and she noticed she had a message from an old friend named Sherry. Sherry was actually an ex-girlfriend from way back in the day. And they just started talking up a storm because Christy was in this crazy situation and she knew Sherry from back in the day. They were old friends. They grew up in the same tiny town, knew all of the same people. So she just dumped all of her problems on Sherry and told her about everything. And Sherry just, she was a great person to talk to. And eventually, she kind of started having feelings for Sherry again. And so she decided she wanted to go meet Sherry in person. And when they did meet, they completely fell head over heels for each other. They fell in love again, and that's when the situation really got explosive, because not only was Christy gay, but now she had a partner to be gay with, and Jim being controlling, collecting this evidence, threatening Christy. Christy was his meal ticket. Without Christy, there's no Jim and money, and there's no drugs. So what do you think he's going to do? Is he going to make do on this threat? But Christy, she's just not having it. She's tired of this life. She's tired of being closeted. So she goes to meet up Sherry and she just never comes home. She's just hanging out with Sherry and Jim explodes. He's threatening her. He's calling her friends and family. And eventually he tells everyone that Christy's gay. He exposes her. And on top of that, he starts sending out this promiscuous pictures, just destroying Christy's reputation in a real foul way. But after all of this, Christy's like, well, what else can he do? He's already exposed me for being gay, tried to ruin my career, told all my friends and family. What more can he do? But turns out there is more that he can do. So Jim's doing everything he can to find Christy, and eventually he does find Christy, and he calls her up on the phone. She's at a hotel. She answers, and he says, "I'm so close to you, I can reach out and touch you." And Christy's looking out the window, and she's like, there's no way that he can see me. There's just no way. And Jim describes what her partner is wearing. So she realizes Jim is literally very close, and he does know where I am. So she agrees to finally come home. And that's when this situation just goes insane. That night, once they get home, Christy tells Jim, I'm really not feeling that well. I'm going to go lay down and we can talk, when I wake up. And while she's laying down, she says she can hear Jim sharpening a knife in the other room because she's laying down in the bedroom. He can hear her sharpening a knife in the other room. All right, so she calls Sherry, and they're on the phone. And he says, hang up the phone. And she's like, I will hang up the phone when I'm done talking to my girlfriend, Sherry. And that's when Jim lunges at her with a knife. Now, Christy thought that Jim punched her a couple of times. But it turns out he was stabbing her with the knife in the side. And he stabbed her like 4 times before she even realized she was being stabbed. He thought she was getting punched. And he grabbed her and threw her against the dresser, and her head bashed against the dresser. She's pretty messed up at this point, right? And she is talking smack back to Jim. She doesn't respect him. You're nothing. If it wasn't for me, you she's just talking mad stuff to Jim, just throwing fire on the situation. And Jim gets even more mad, and he goes into the other room and he grabs Christy's pink 9mm. And Christy looks at him, says, "You ain't gonna shoot me?" Literally taunting him, and he does end up shooting her. He shoots Christy, and Christy is laying there dying on the floor. Jim probably thought that she was dead, or gosh darn near, because in the midst of that fight, the knife slips from his hand and he gets a huge gash on his hand, right? That commonly happens when people are stabbing. I guess the blood, and he gashed his hand. So he goes into the other room and he turns on the shower, and Christy testifies that she can hear him turn the shower on. As she's kind of dying there on the floor, she's thinking, get up, Christy, get up. This is your only chance. If she doesn't escape now, there's no way she's surviving this. Because in the midst of this fight, Jim realizes that he can't let her live after stabbing her. Christy summons all of her courage and all of her strength, and she gets up and runs out the front door and runs into the street and tries to flag down one of the passerbys that's driving on the street. The first one just keeps going. And then what she calls her guardian angel stops the car. She gets in the car, she tells him the situation, and he takes her to the hospital and calls the police. And Christy literally escapes just by the skin of her teeth. Jim's in the showering, thinking the job is basically done. So the police go to the house in search of Jim, and Jim isn't there. Jim goes on the run. Why wouldn't you? Because of what he did. So they're looking for Jim, and they actually end up finding them in a vacant house, somewhat near in a vacant shed. And he's holding the bloody knife and a bloody rag, and he's injured on his hands. So they take him into custody and they arrest him, and there's a lot of evidence against Jim. Okay, there's a lot of evidence. So of course, Jim's put on trial, and the charges are 2nd-degree attempted murder and 2nd-degree attempted manslaughter. And Jim's defense is, it's self-defense. Look at Christy. She's an incredibly talented female boxer. She attacked me, right? But is it self-defense? I mean, he shot her. He stabbed her multiple times. So Jim is actually convicted, and he was sentenced to 25 to life. Okay. And if you want to see what Jim looks like, you go watch the Netflix documentary. You see the real Jim. They interview him. He's a character. Okay, well, let's just say that in the least. But just in case you want to know, it's an inspirational story because very soon after that, with a bullet in her back, Christy goes back to training. She finds a new trainer, and she goes on to fight to try to get her 50th win. She continues her boxing career in spite of all her injuries. Christy would testify in court against Jim and said, "You stabbed me 4 times. You shot me. And guess what, mother lover? I walked out. I walked out." And Jim would later say that Christy was the worst thing that ever happened to him. What do you think about that?